Okay, y'all, so this next chapter is called Punishment, and this is going to be the punishment for the girls and Teeny for helping Miss Derby hide her baby, her and Noah's baby, and for lying to Mr. Derby. Just a reminder, sadly, of course, Noah is dead, murdered by Mr. Derby, and their baby girl, who never had a name, is also dead. At this point in the novel, Isabel is very weak from having the baby. We don't have, this is the 1700s, so she's not in the hospital, she's just at home. They don't have the medicine that we have today to help mothers through the pain or help with recovery, things like that. She's just in bed. Also, the doctor is still there. As he said back in the other chapter, it took them 4 hours to get there. So he would be there to stay the night, get supper, things like that. Despite him having to hear everything that happened. He didn't actually see anything. He never left the house. So he didn't see anything, but he heard it. Of course, he would know what happened. All right, so chapter 28, Punishment. Let me start this over, folks. Okay. Chapter 28, Punishment. No edits in these videos, in these flu videos. Not since the day her mother died had Polly felt such agony. She gasped in disbelief, unable to catch her breath. Head spinning, she clung to Amari, who was choking on her sobs. Mrs. Derby threw herself onto her child and then fainted. This time, for real. Mr. Derby dropped the gun, and then he looked at his hands. He seemed stunned. He turned to Clay, and he said quietly, "Go tell old Jubal to get up here. Take care of this. All of this." He would not look at the bodies. "And make sure that Sarah Jane gets punished," he added without emotion. Polly watched Clay disappear into the darkness with a look of satisfaction on his face. Again, devil number 2, Clay Derby, happy that he took part in the murder of an innocent man and child. Baby, infant. Dr. Hoskins peered out of the door then, unsure of what he might encounter. "Come get my wife, doctor," Mr. Derby called. "I believe she's fainted again. Unfortunately, she had to witness the disciplining of some unruly slaves, and it proved a bit much for her. See to her, will you, old fellow?" Mr. Derby took a deep breath and smoothed his doublet. The doctor crept slowly on the bloody scene, observed it all, but made no comment. He picked up Mrs. Derby in his arms and carried her back to the house. Lena waited at the door to assist them, her eyes bright with fear. Then Mr. Derby turned his attention to Teeny, Polly, and Amari, who huddled together. "Follow me," he told them curtly. He led them down the familiar path to Teeny's kitchen, where he stopped. "Where's that boy, Tidbit?" he asked Teeny. She hesitated. "Why, I don't rightly know, sir. He done heard all the noise, I guess, and it probably scared him. Maybe he ran off to the woods." "Call to him, and you'd better hope that he answers." Polly could tell that Teeny was not sure what to do. Tidbit." "Call to him so he hears you," Mr. Derby demanded. "Tidbit, honey, are you in there?" Teeny called, her voice quivering. A faint rustling could be heard coming from the kindling box. Mr. Derby marched over, tossed aside small pieces of firewood, and pulled the boy out of the box by one arm. The dog growled softly. "Mama?" Tidbit called out. When Mr. Derby dropped the boy to the ground, Tidbit ran quickly to the skirts of his mother. She picked him up and held him close to her body. Mr. Derby spoke then. Polly sensed that she was just barely in control of himself. That's my cat, if you hear in the background. "Follow me," he demanded once more, and he led them a few paces from the kitchen to the smokehouse. He pulled out a key, unlocked the door, and turned to look at the frightened group in front of them. Now, if you remember, Teeny has already told us earlier in the book that nobody has a key to the smokehouse. She doesn't even have a key. That's the one thing that she can't get into, because being the cook, she's the most trusted slave on the plantation, but she can't get into the smokehouse. There's only one key for that. You, he said, pointing at Polly. You are a liar, and I will not have such a person in my household. Polly cowered before him, her hands held in front of her face. Have mercy, sir, she whispered. He ignored her. And you, he said to Polly with consternation, have been trouble since I was kind enough to bring you here. Amari looked frightened, Polly thought, but furious at him as well. That gave Polly courage to stand a little straighter in spite of Mr. Derby's fury. And finally you, he said fiercely to Teeny. I trusted you to obey me. Your responsibility was to me, and you failed. I'm so sorry, sir, Teeny mumbled. Too late, he said harshly. He thought for a moment. When Dr. Hoskins leaves in the morning, he'll have 3 passengers. I'll send Clay with him to make sure there are no more problems. If it were not for my son, I might have never discovered the whole truth. Polly searched for the words that might calm him down or change his mind. Sir, she began, but Mr. Derby ignored her as he firmly pushed each of them into the dark, windowless smokehouse. Polly, Amari, and Teeny looked at one another, but did not fight him or object. They did not want to do anything to further incur his anger. Mr. Derby slowly closed the door and then opened it again. Tomorrow is market day in Charlestown, he said. Polly, I plan to sell your indenture to a whorehouse in New Orleans. You'll bring a pretty penny. They like 'em young down there. He uttered a short, harsh laugh. Tears welled up in Polly's eyes, but she shook her head and she refused to cry. Anger began to replace her misery, and she looked at Mr. Derby with steely-eyed fury. And Mina? I can find another toy for my son to play with. I'm sure I can get more than what I paid for you. A broken-in African is highly sought after. Amari looked devastated, but she, too, seemed to have run out of tears. She faced Mr. Derby with quiet resolve. The 2 girls stood there, stony and silent. You'll leave at first light. They heard the lock fasten firmly in the latch and his footsteps as he headed back to the house. But what about me, sir? Teeny called out through one of the wooden slats of the smokehouse. Who's going to cook your food if you sells me? The sound of his boots stopped. Oh, Teeny, he called back. Why, I'd never sell you. You're much too valuable. Teeny breathed a small sigh of relief. She clung to Tidbit fiercely in the darkness. Oh, thank you, sir, she whispered. Oh, no, I'm selling Tidbit instead. Mr. Derby's voice said clearly. The sound of his boots on the hard dirt disappeared as he headed back to the big house. Teeny's wails echoed in the darkness. So, the punishment is quite terrible. Probably more than I could ever imagine. He did not kill them. I mean, he could have done that. It would have been perfectly within his rights because he essentially owns every single one of them except for Polly. She's an indenture. But I think that the law would sadly have mercy on Mr. Derby, and he would probably not get in trouble even if he were to kill Polly in this time frame of America, a very dark part of our past. But in order to hurt Teeny, he decides that he's going to sell Tidbit, which is very terrible. Oh my gosh, that's so terrible. But he's doing that purposely to hurt her, because that's the way that he knows that he can hurt her the most. And he wants to sell Amari just because that will be money, and he wants to sell Polly specifically to be a prostitute, again, just to hurt her. He's all about getting revenge and things like that, because he's a terrible person.